Hi, my name is Adrian, and welcome to the Consulting Academy. Today, we're going to go over how you can improve your analysis in the case interview. If you haven't already, please check out our video on hypothesis building and opening the case interview before you watch this video. Now, as a quick recap, the interviewee-led case interview is typically split into three parts: the opening, the analysis, and the closing. After building a solid framework or hypothesis, the next thing that you'd want to do is to conduct some analysis and test your hypothesis. And this is exactly what today's section is about. So, three main things that we want to cover. First of all, the profitability framework and how you could effectively use it to drive your analysis. Secondly, qualitative analysis and how you could use it to supplement your analysis. And last but not least, I want to share four essential concepts or principles that I try to apply in every single case, including the 80-20 rule, segmenting, MECE, and benchmarking. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So the first thing, the profitability framework. Now, many of you might find this very easy, and it is one of the more simple concepts, especially for business students. However, the challenging part is not learning what the profitability framework is, but learning how to use it. And when it comes to the profitability framework, there are two main approaches that we highly recommend: top down and bottom up. So let's start with top down. Essentially what top down is you start with a large number, an overall number, such as in the context of profitability, the market size. And on top of the market size, you might also want to consider the market growth if you're talking about a specific timeline in your case. From there, you want to work your way down. So what this means is from the overall market size, you figure out how much market share that your client could realistically capture. Now, this usually gives you a number for revenue, but remember, we're trying to calculate the profit here. So the last step that you need to do for the top-down approach is to multiply your revenue by the profit margin. And using this method, it will then give you the estimated profit. Now, in general, we would highly recommend this model for larger companies with complex business model. And you'll see why this is the case later. The second approach, called the bottom-up, is probably what many of you are more familiar with. In this method, you start at the unit level. You figure out what the price is, and you figure out what the cost per unit is. From there, you work your way up by calculating the number of units that your client can realistically sell. And keep in mind that in this part, it is important to consider multiple streams of revenue. Now let's take a look at example. If you were talking about smartphones here and your client is Apple, Apple might sell a lot of phones, so you need to figure out the revenue stream for their iPhones. But in addition to phones, Apple also sells other products such as laptops and watches. And therefore, if you want to estimate the profit of Apple, you need to calculate the profit for not only phones, but also laptops and watches. In general, we recommend the bottom-up approach for smaller businesses with simple business models. Now that I've explained both of these approaches to you, let me talk a little bit more on when we want to use each of these approaches. Now, as I said earlier, we generally recommend a top-down approach for larger companies with complex business models. And the reason for this is that it's very difficult to estimate the price per unit and the number of units you can sell if you're talking about a dynamic business model. For example, for companies such as Amazon, they charge different commission rates depending on the type of product that's sold and the price of the product that's being sold. For this reason, in real life, if we were to estimate the profit of a company such as Amazon, the easier way would definitely be to go from top down. Now, on the other hand, if you're doing a case where you know every single product that the client is selling, it makes perfect sense to do bottom up. This is because you already likely know the price, cost, and the number of units sold for each of these products, and therefore the profit that you calculate based on that would be quite accurate. Now, there are some cases, such as market sizing cases, where both of these approaches would work. In those cases, it's all right to communicate that you have thought of both of these approaches and ask the interviewer which one they have information on. To wrap up this section on the profitability framework, my final remarks would be that this is a very good starting point for your case if the objective is related to profit. By adopting one of these approaches, you know exactly what sort of numbers you need to ask for. For top-down, you need market size, market growth, market share, and profit margin. And for bottom-up, you need the price per unit, cost per unit, and the number of units sold. Having said this, if you straight up ask the interviewers for these numbers, they're not always going to be handed to you on a plate. So while it's good to use these numbers as a starting point, you are often expected to do a deeper level of qualitative analysis to back this up. So for example, in order to estimate market share, your interviewer might require you to first understand the competitive landscape. So as part of this exercise, you could be asking a few questions, and this is where your business knowledge comes into play. All of the concepts and frameworks that you get seen thrown around a lot, like the 3 Cs, competition, customer, and company, might come into play here. For example, you might ask the question, who are our competitors? To follow that up, you might be asking, what are they doing right? i.e., what do their customers really care about? And the last question you might want to ask is, how can our clients compete? So let's take a look at some of these questions. So starting with the first question, who are our competitors? For this question, a good starting point would be to know the names of your competitors and how much market share each of them own. The next question that you might have is, what are their products? Who are their customers, and what are their competitive advantages? Knowing this information might be able to guide your thinking, as you might be able to identify threats and opportunities in the market. But how can you make this analysis a little bit more concrete? Well, let's take a look at the second question, which is, what are these companies doing right? What do their customers really care about? Often, in many cases, you're expected to come up with what consultants call a customer journey, which is essentially the process that each customer has to undergo whenever they want to buy a product or a service. So for example, if we're talking about an e-commerce case, we might be required to brainstorm what customers look for in e-commerce. A few responses that might come into your mind are, for example, pricing, product variety, product quality. However, in general, what we would recommend in these sort of questions is to have a more structured approach. So if you're doing a customer journey for e-commerce, try to put yourself in the shoes of a customer and go in chronological order, step by step, what the customer would do. So let's go step by step. If I'm a customer who's using e-commerce, the first thing I might want to do is plan what I want to buy in the first place. After doing so, I will search for the products that I want to buy. And after identifying a product I'm interested in, the next step might be to pay. Afterwards, I fill in the delivery details and wait for the package to be shipped to me. And finally, after the product arrives, I might want to do some follow-up on the delivery process and to give some feedback. So here we have already built a value chain that the customer goes through whenever they undertake the e-commerce journey. The next step then will be to think of a few pain points or a few factors for each part of the step. For example, during planning, I might want to see tailored recommendations in the e-commerce homepage, and I care about having a user-friendly interface so I could easily navigate around the website. When it comes to searching, I want good filters so I can identify low prices, high quality products, and reputable brand names. When it comes to payment, I want to make sure that the ease of payment is high and that I can pay with the existing cards that I have. For delivery, I want to make sure that it's fast, accurate, secure, and that I can choose multiple delivery options. And finally, for post-delivery, if anything goes wrong, I want a good customer service and I'd want the goods to arrive as promised. Now, as you can see, just by building this customer journey out, we make sure that we don't miss any important steps along the process. The last piece of common qualitative analysis that you might want to conduct is looking at the company and figure out whether the client has an advantage or disadvantage. A list of questions you could ask, for example, is, do we have an existing customer base to leverage? Can our assets help us cut costs? Do we have the brand to charge a higher price? Can we afford to lower our price? Do we have enough resources to make this happen? Do we have specific culture or beliefs? And is there any resistance from our board of directors? Now, if you want to hone your qualitative analysis, there's a lot of existing great literature online, but the best way I would recommend you to improve it is just to practice as much as possible. In addition, if you take some time to understand some industries that you may not be familiar with, you generally do a better job in your qualitative analysis. So given that there's already so much existing material on qualitative analysis, we won't go into much more detail today. But the last part I wanted to cover before we wrap this workshop up are the 4 essential concepts that I mentioned earlier. And here I'm going to go over them one by one. First concept is called the 80-20 rule, which states that for many outcomes, 80% of the outcomes, which we can also call the output or the result, comes from 20% of all causes, which we can also call as the input. The point of this rule is that we prioritize and focus on that 20%. So if this sounds confusing to you, don't worry. Here's an example that might make this clearer. For example, you might encounter a case where the client is a pharmaceuticals company and they want to cut costs. Now here, if we want to look at their process of developing drugs, for example, you find that there are a few steps such as research and development, patenting, manufacturing, marketing, and distribution. Research and development only covers around 20% of the entire process. However, if you take a look at the costs, you've noticed that R&D takes up 80% of the costs. So considering this is such a large cost driver, a good idea might be to start by analyzing the research and development. A good time for you to use the 80-20 rule is when you don't know where to start, because if you're feeling lost in a case, it's always good to prioritize the main factors that matter. In addition, you only have 20 to 30 minutes in every case, so you likely not have time to analyze everything. And when that's the case, your 80-20 rule is your best friend. Second concept I want to talk about is segmenting, which is dividing one item into multiple parts or categories. And here, it is important that you do this with a recommendation bias. What this means is when you take something and split it into segments, you want to make sure that these segments are unique enough so that you can generate recommendations for each of them depending on your insights. For example, if your client is an investment bank, it's quite complicated to look at the entire bank as a whole, considering that it has so many functions. So in that case, you might want to segment the investment bank based on its three main functions: the front office, the middle office, and the back office. This is a good starting point because you could likely generate very different recommendations for each of these offices. So when do you want to segment? Well, you want to do it when the problem is too complex to solve as one large item, which happens a lot in case interviews. Segmenting can also give you additional angles while brainstorming, which will lead you to a more comprehensive set of ideas. On the topic of segmenting, the third rule that we want to talk about is MECE, which stands for mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive. If you've taken a statistics class before, you'd likely encounter this concept. The idea is to ensure that your framework buckets do not overlap, but covers all forms of possibilities, or in some cases, most possibilities. So what's MECE and what's not? For example, the age group that you see on the screen here is not MECE. Why? Well, imagine you were to put a 10-year-old in one of those buckets. The 10-year-old would fall under both the first and the second bracket. Similarly, if you wanted to put an 18-year-old in one of the buckets, he or she will fit under both the second bracket and the third bracket. And finally, this is also not completely exhaustive, as if you're talking about a 2-year-old or a 26-year-old, he or she will not fall under any of these brackets, and there's simply no place to categorize these people. So how do we make this framework MECE? Well, it's simple. All we have to do is to adjust the age brackets so they do not overlap and add an others category so that we can cover all possibilities. MECE is a very useful concept when you're building a framework or a hypothesis to ensure that you don't get lost and that you don't waste any time. It's also very helpful whenever you're segmenting. The last idea I want to talk about is benchmarking, which is comparing your client's present numbers to either competitors or their own past data. For example, if we say that your client has earned $20 million this year, we don't necessarily know if it's a good thing or a bad thing for the client. If the client is a small company, for example, this might be the best they've ever done. But on the other hand, if your client is a large company, this might be the worst that they've performed in years. So a good way to validate that is to compare that to either competitors or benchmark by, for example, saying $20 million was 50% higher than our revenue from last year. This statement ensures that we at least see that the client is making some good progress. Benchmarking is very useful when you're trying to contextualize the number, and consultants do it in real life all the time. It's also great if you're trying to understand the best practice of what your competitors are trying to do. So with these four concepts in mind, we're confident that your analysis will be much more robust and complete. With that, we've covered the basics of analysis, and again, we encourage all of you to practice as much as possible. That's it for today. Please like, share, subscribe, and check out our website, and we will see you next time.